Chapter 8. Conquest of Political Power. The future of democracy, as we have seen, is connected to the future of the labor movement. But does democracy make a workers' revolution unnecessary or impossible? Does it mean workers no longer need to take control of political power? Bernstein tries to answer this by carefully comparing the good and bad sides of social reform and social revolution, as if he were weighing spices in a store. He sees making new laws as the work of intelligence and revolution as the work of emotion. To him, reform is a slow way to make progress, while revolution is a fast way. He thinks making laws is an orderly force, while revolution is a sudden, uncontrolled force. We have long known that small-minded reformers try to find good and bad sides in everything. They nibble at every idea a little bit. But history does not care about such small calculations. The neat little pile of good sides falls apart the moment history takes a sharp turn. In reality, both lawmaking and revolution happen because of deeper forces, not because people sit down and weigh their pros and cons. In the history of capitalist society, making new laws helped the rising class grow stronger until it had enough power to take over, get rid of the old system, and create a new one. Bernstein, who strongly opposes the idea of workers taking political power and calls it violent nonsense, makes a big mistake. He calls this idea a mistake, even though it has always been the main force of human history. Ever since societies were divided into classes, where the struggle between them was the most important part of history, every rising class has had one goal: to take political power. This has always been the beginning and the end of every period in history. We can see this in the long fight between farmers and rich landowners in ancient Rome, in the battles between knights and church leaders in medieval times, and in the fight of artisans against nobles in medieval cities. In modern history, we see the same thing in the fight of the rich business owners against feudalism. Making new laws and revolutions are not simply two different choices for progress, like picking between hot or cold sausages at a market. They are both important parts of how class society develops. They depend on each other, yet they also stand against each other, just like the North and South Poles or the rich and the working class. Every legal system comes from a revolution. In the history of class struggle, revolutions create new political systems, while laws simply shape the political life of a society that already exists. Reform by itself has no independent power apart from revolution. In every historical period, reforms only happen in the direction set by the last revolution and continue only as long as that revolution's energy is still being felt. To put it more clearly, in every period, reforms can only happen within the social system created by the last revolution. This is the real heart of the issue. It goes against history to say that working for reforms is just a slow revolution and that a revolution is just a bunch of small reforms. A big change in society and a change in laws are not different because one takes longer than the other, but because of what they really do. The secret to changing history by using political power is in turning small, simple changes into a whole new way of living, that is, in moving from one kind of society to another. That is why people who say they support changing laws instead of taking over political power and starting a full revolution are not choosing a calmer or slower path to the same end. They are choosing a different end. Instead of fighting to build a new society, they fight only for small changes to the old one. If we follow the ideas of revisionism in politics, we end up with the same result as when we follow revisionism in economics. Our plan then becomes not to make true socialism, but to change capitalism, not to end the wage system, but to lessen its unfairness. That is, to stop the abuses of capitalism rather than to stop capitalism itself. Does the way that law changes and revolutions work together apply only to old class struggles? Some might think that now, because the bourgeois legal system is so developed, moving society from one period to another is done by changing laws, and that the idea of the working class taking over the state is just an empty phrase, as Bernstein calls it. The opposite is true. What makes bourgeois society different from older class societies, like those of ancient times and the Middle Ages, is exactly that the rule of one class does not depend on acquired rights, but on real economic relationships. In other words, wage work is not a legal matter, but a pure economic one. In our legal system, there is no law that shows one class ruling over another today. The few old laws that still show such class rule, like those about servants, are just leftovers from feudal society. How can we end wage slavery by changing laws if wage slavery is not even written into the laws? Bernstein, who wants to end capitalism by changing laws, finds himself in the same situation as the Russian policeman Uspensky described. Quickly I seized the rascal by the collar. But what do I see? The poor fellow has no collar. And that is exactly Bernstein's problem. All previous societies were based on a fight between a ruling class and an oppressed class, Communist Manifesto. In earlier parts of modern society, this fight showed up in clear legal rules and sometimes allowed new kinds of relationships to exist within the old system. In the midst of serfdom, the serf raised himself to the rank of a member of the town community, Communist Manifesto. How did that happen? It happened because many feudal privileges around the city were slowly removed. These privileges included forced work, corvée, the right to wear special clothes, the inheritance tax, the lord's claim to the best cattle, a personal tax, forced marriage, and the right of succession, all of which together made up serfdom. In the same way, the small middle class of the Middle Ages managed to raise itself, even though it was still under the strict control of feudal absolutism, to become a true bourgeoisie, Communist Manifesto. They did this by partly or completely loosening the group restrictions and by slowly changing the tax system and the army. When we think about this in a general way rather than just from history, we can imagine that a legal change by reform could take society from feudal to bourgeois. But what do we see in real life? We see that legal reforms did not stop the middle class from taking political power. Instead, these changes helped prepare for and lead to that takeover. A complete change in society and government was needed to end slavery and completely get rid of feudalism. But things are very different now. There is no law that makes the working class have to accept capitalism. Instead, poverty and not having the tools to produce things force the working class to accept it. No law in the world can give the working class the tools they need as long as they stay in a capitalist society, because it is economic changes, not laws, that have taken these tools away from the people who make things. Also, the unfair treatment of workers in wage labor is not based on laws. How much workers are paid is not set by laws but by economic factors. Capitalist exploitation happens because work is treated like a product that makes more value than what it costs to keep the worker alive. In short, the basic ways that the rich control workers cannot be changed by making new laws in a capitalist society because these ways were not made by the rich in laws and do not follow legal rules. Bernstein seems to ignore this when he talks about socialist reforms. But he also hints at it when he writes, "The economic motive acts freely today, while formerly it was masked by all kinds of relations of domination by all sorts of ideology." One strange thing about capitalism is that the parts of a future society first show up not in a way that looks like socialism, but in a way that moves further away from socialism. Making things becomes more and more a social activity. But how does this social side of production show up in capitalism? It shows up in big companies, shareholding firms, and cartels, where the conflicts between rich and workers, the unfair treatment of workers, and the control over work become even stronger. In the army, as capitalism grows, it first makes military service longer, then shorter, and eventually leads to a system that looks like a citizen militia. But all of this happens in a modern military system where the state controls the people and the differences between social classes are very clear. In politics, as democracy grows in a good environment, all groups of people can take part in political life, creating a kind of people state. But this participation is still in the form of a parliament run by the rich, where the fights between classes and class control are still shown openly. Because capitalism works through these problems, it is necessary to take the true core of a socialist society out of its capitalist covering. That is why the working class must take over political power and completely end the capitalist system. Bernstein says some other things too. He says that if making democracy stronger actually makes the fights between capitalists worse, then social democracy should try very hard to stop new social reforms and the spread of democratic institutions so that its work does not become even harder. This would be a good idea if social democracy liked the small-minded task of choosing only the good parts of history and ignoring the bad. But if that were the case, it should also try to stop capitalism altogether, because there is no doubt that capitalism is the troublemaker putting up all these barriers against socialism. Still, capitalism not only causes problems, but also offers the only chances to make a true socialist plan come true. The same is true for democracy. If the rich people now find democracy useless or annoying, it is very important and necessary for the working class. It is needed because democracy creates the political tools, like self-government and the right to vote, that the working class can use as strong supports in its task to change the old society. Democracy is essential for the working class because only by using its democratic rights and fighting for democracy can workers come to understand their own class interests and their important historical role. In short, democracy is needed not because it makes the working class's taking of power unnecessary, but because it makes this taking of power both needed and possible. When Engels wrote the preface to Class Struggles in France and changed the plans for the modern labor movement by urging legal battles instead of fighting on the streets, he was not thinking about immediately taking over power. Every line of the preface shows that he was talking about the everyday struggle. He was not saying how workers should behave when they finally take power, but how they should act while still living under a capitalist government. Engels was giving advice to the workers who were being oppressed, not to workers who had already won. Marx once said about the English farm question, "We shall probably succeed easier by buying the estates of the landlords." This does not mean what the working class should do before they win power, but rather what they can do after they have won. Only when the workers are in charge can they think about buying the property of the old ruling class. Marx meant that the working class should use its power peacefully, not simply swap one kind of rule for another set of capitalist laws. Marx and Engels were clear that the working class must take over political power. Bernstein, however, thinks that the ordinary parliament of the rich is the tool by which we can make the biggest change in history, the change from capitalism to socialism. Bernstein starts his idea by warning the working class not to take power too soon. He says that the working class should let the rich society stay as it is and even suffer a terrible defeat. If the working class did take power too early, they might end up, according to Bernstein's advice, simply going to sleep. This means his idea tells the workers to do nothing at the most important times, which is like betraying their own cause. Our plan must be useful at every moment of the struggle. If our plan explains how society goes from capitalism to socialism, it must also describe every step along that road. It should clearly tell the working class what to do at every moment on the path to socialism. There must never be a time when the working class has to give up the plan or is left without it. In real life, this means that when the working class comes to power by the force of events, they are always able and morally required to take actions that move society towards socialism. The idea that the socialist plan might suddenly fail at any moment during the working class rule hides another belief, that the socialist plan can never really work at any time. What if these temporary steps towards socialism happen too soon? This question is based on a lot of wrong ideas about how big social changes really happen. First, when the working class takes political power, it doesn't happen by accident or through some trick. It only happens when economic and political conditions have reached a certain level of development. There are rare cases, like the Paris Commune, where the working class didn't plan to take power, but found it in their hands because everyone else had abandoned it. But normally, power isn't just handed over, it comes when society is ready for change. From a political point of view, the working class cannot take power too early. But when we think about keeping power, a revolution that happens before the time is right is a danger hanging over us like a sword. No amount of praying, begging, or worrying can stop that danger. And this is for two simple reasons. First, it is impossible to imagine that a change as huge as the shift from capitalist society to socialist society can happen all at once in one happy act. To think that is to believe in ideas like those of Blanky. The move to socialism requires a long and hard struggle, during which the working class will probably be pushed back more than once. From the end result's point of view, this means they might have taken power too early at first. Second, we cannot avoid the working class taking power too early, because these early moves are a very important part of setting up the conditions for the final victory. During the political crisis that comes with taking power, and through a long and tough struggle, the working class will gain the political experience needed to win the revolution for good. In this way, these early attempts against state power are key historical events that help bring about the final win. Seen from this angle, the idea that the working class can take power too soon is a silly argument based on a simple view of society's change, one that assumes there is a fixed moment for winning the class struggle that exists outside the struggle itself. Since the working class cannot take power any other way but prematurely, because they must take power one or more times before they can hold it for good, the objection to an early takeover is really just another way of opposing the working class's goal of controlling state power. Just as all roads lead to Rome, we must conclude that the revisionist proposal to lower the final aim of the socialist movement is really a suggestion to give up on the socialist movement altogether.